The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, leadership style continues to gain more and more popularity with time. So much so that even non-Muslims, people who are academics or even people who are journalists, are starting to look into the leadership style of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And there are many books that are starting to get published. Many have already been published, and many are continuing to get published about how the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, led the community. What was his political strategy? What was his social maneuvers? And etc. etc. And the interesting thing about that is that they are taking something that is a bit too vast for a secular context, and they're trying to distill it to a leadership or to leadership points and leadership skills that can be viewed from a purely secular perspective. Now, looking at the strategies that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, followed in his lives, as well as the techniques he adhered to and the maneuvers that he took and he exercised, is not necessarily a bad thing. However, purely basing the leadership of a prophet or a messenger on secular rules is the issue. And this is not something that is new, and it's not something that has not been tested before. During the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, the Meccan people, the people who ruled Mecca, the elites of Mecca, they were looking at different strategies to basically gain victory and gain ground with or against the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And they were looking at the plane, at this conflict plane, purely from a secular perspective. And despite them having the upper hand and having more power and having more money and having more tribes standing with them, they still lost. Eventually, Quraysh, the Meccan tribes, eventually they lost. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, and his message, the Islamic message, dominated not only Mecca but the Arabian Peninsula. And the way that this happened is not merely based on human skills. It's not merely based on this figure that is a hero that went on and did this huge, massive social change. Yes, definitely the Prophet, peace be upon him, is a unique character in the different skills he has, but there is an element of spirituality that is attached to that leadership. And let me give you an example. You can find two people very charismatic. One person is a scholar, is a religious scholar, could be an imam, could be somebody who specializes in jurisprudence, could be a judge, and those guys have very strong charisma. You can also look at a king or a prime minister or a political leader who also has that charisma. Now, despite both people having charisma, the type of charisma that they have is different. For example, if you walk into a palace of a king, yes, you might get that sense of strong leadership and strong hold and strong management, but it is not very comforting charisma. It could be an attractive charisma and a captivating charisma, but it is not necessarily a comforting one. Where if you look at a scholar or a prophet or a messenger, the type of charisma they have is somewhat can be described as a spiritual charisma. And this applies, charisma is only one of the elements of leadership. This element of spiritual versus secular does not only apply to charisma, but it applies to all other factors of leadership. And hence, when we read some of the contemporary work that is trying to merely study the secular skills, the human skills that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had that were influential in delivering his message, we're not doing that character, that figure, that personality, which is the Prophet, peace be upon him, justice. Because there is a huge other aspect of his leadership that is based on divine connection and divine spirituality. Now, we find also historically many of the scholars, the Islamic scholars, they would not be people that would push themselves to leadership roles. And this is very intriguing. Despite being, for example, the top scholar in the city or the top scholar in the jurisdiction, they would avoid at all costs taking any sort of leadership role. And they would go to very extreme extents to be independent of the power and the oversight of political leaders. Because those scholar and those Islamic leaders, those scholars of the community looks up to them for guidance as well as righteous leadership. Hence, we cannot just merely study their leadership skills based on contemporary secular measures. And hence, when we look at the Islamic leadership or building Muslim leaders, we cannot merely base it on the secular rules. There has to be another way to measure and to build leaders of tomorrow within the Muslim community. And that applies actually to any religious community, but the context here that we're talking about is the Muslim community. So I will leave you with that thought. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you in the next episode.